Welcome back, everyone. Let's wrap up this series with the fifth and final video on the authorship and dating of the Gospels. We will, of course, talk about authorship and dating of the Gospel of John in this video, as well as at the end, we're going to talk just briefly about methodology. I think it'll be a really good way to wrap this series up. So, as with the other Gospels, with the Gospel of John, we have an extremely strong attestation in church history with respect to authorship. From Irenaeus, who personally was connected with Polycarp, who knew John. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, published a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. He says, "I am able to describe the very place in which the blessed Polycarp sat as he discoursed, and his goings out and his comings in, and the manner of his life and his physical appearance and his discourses to the people, and the accounts which he gave of his intercourse with John and with the others who had seen the Lord." Most scholars recognize that this John, certainly a reference to John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, is, so far as Irenaeus is concerned, none other than the John whom he emphatically insists is the fourth evangelist. Of course, throughout this series, we've talked about a lot of quotes from the church fathers, and so we'll see a lot of similar quotes in this video with respect to the Gospel of John. I won't read through all of them. You've heard something very similar before. If you've watched this series, I'll just summarize a couple of phrases in them and then put these quotes in a pinned comment for you if you'd like to read them in full yourself. Clement refers to John, who wrote a spiritual gospel. We have Tertullian referring to the apostles for the authors of the Testament, and he refers to John as publishing a gospel. According to Origen, there are 4 gospels, and John is the author of the final and 4th gospel. Now, in this case, an argument from silence is actually valid when it comes to Eusebius, because it is significant that he, who had access to many works that are now lost, speaks without reserve of the 4th gospel as the unquestioned work of St. John. The silence is most significant precisely because it was Eusebius' concern to discuss the doubtful cases. So just like with the other 3 Gospels, we have extremely strong attestation in church history. So you may be wondering, how is it that scholars can still doubt the authorship of the Gospels? The fact remains that despite support for Johannine authorship by a few front-rank scholars in this century, a large majority of contemporary scholars reject this view. As we shall see, much of their argumentation turns on their reading of the internal evidence. It also requires their virtual dismissal of the external evidence. This is particularly regrettable. Most scholars of antiquity, were they assessing the authorship of some other document, could not so easily set aside evidence as plentiful, consistent, and plainly tied to the source as is the external evidence that supports Johannine authorship. The majority of contemporary biblical scholars do not rest nearly as much weight on external evidence as do their colleagues in classical scholarship. Carson is right on track. Many New Testament scholars, because of their insatiable skepticism, as well as their aberrant methodology, fall under criticism by their peers. Blakelock notes, "A classical scholar finds it difficult to be patient with some of the exotic theories of literary criticism which have bedeviled New Testament studies. New Testament scholars refuse to see what the classicists so naturally see, a record of life in the first century, which must at least be accorded its unique value as historical material. When critical theory seeks to persuade that liturgical and spiritual needs and aspirations taking shape from nowhere and within the lifetime of those who had known the first half of the first century, then created a supporting literature, the narratives and sayings which form the Gospels, fantasy is propounded, which would provoke ridicule in any less confined and introverted sphere of literary criticism." A scathing critique of the methodology of some New Testament scholars indeed. Let's turn to internal evidence. The 4th Gospel mentions the 12 4 times. We may infer that the beloved disciple was one of the 12, because he was present at the Last Supper, and other Gospels indicate that Jesus celebrated this supper with the 12 and apparently the 12 only. The 4th Gospel mentions 5 of the 12 by name: Simon Peter, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, and Judas Iscariot. It refers to the sons of Zebedee without mentioning their names. Their names were, of course, James and John. That the Apostle John is not mentioned by name in the fourth gospel leaves open the possibility, but does not prove, that he was the beloved disciple, and therefore the gospel's anonymous author. Cruz then narrows down the possibilities even further. That the disciple who wrote these things came to be known as the beloved disciple and was the one who reclined next to Jesus at the Last Supper suggests he enjoyed some intimacy with him. The synoptic gospels indicate that of the 12, Jesus chose 3, Peter, James, and John, to be present at the raising of Jairus' daughter, to witness the transfiguration, and to be with him during his agony in Gethsemane. It was also Peter, James, and John who asked Jesus for an explanation concerning the time of fulfillment of his prophecy concerning the destruction of the temple. It is highly likely that one of these 3 intimates of Jesus was the one who became known as the beloved disciple. It is unlikely to have been Peter, as he is frequently mentioned by name in the fourth gospel. It could be either of the sons of Zebedee, for neither of these disciples is mentioned by name. However, it is unlikely to have been James, as he was martyred very early on. And with respect to the beloved disciple, Carson comments, the traditional view that he is John, the son of Zebedee, has been advanced for reasons of quite different weight. The fact that neither John nor James is mentioned by name in the fourth gospel, which nevertheless has place not only for prominent apostles like Peter and Andrew, but also for relatively obscure members of the apostolic band like Philip and Judas, is passing strange unless there is some reason for it. The traditional reason seems most plausible. The beloved disciple is none other than John, and he deliberately avoids using his personal name. Who then is the evangelist? To put the matter another way, what is the relationship between the beloved disciple and the fourth evangelist? The traditional answer is that they are one and the same. So what about the dating of John's Gospel? Well, I introduced you to CSNTM a couple of videos ago, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. Let's jump back to that site and look at a couple of these old manuscripts of John's Gospel. We'll start with P75, and this goes back to the 3rd century. And you can zoom in and see how well this manuscript has been preserved. Absolutely stunning. NRK ein halagos, kai halagos ein proston theon. This is, of course, John 1, verse 1. And you can read just about every character on here. Absolutely incredible. P52 is a very small manuscript dated back to the 2nd century that contains a couple of lines from John chapter 18. So why is any of this important? Well, there are scholars like F.C. Bauer back in the 19th century, and then there were other scholars before him and those who built on his work after him, and there was a lot of ink spilled talking about the late and later date of John's Gospel on in to the 3rd century. But then P52 was discovered, which put an upper limit on the dating of John's Gospel. This little shred of a manuscript literally sent thousands of pages of bad scholarship to the flames. And because of the discovery of P52, most scholars conclude that the fourth gospel was written at the latest in the final decade of the 1st century, and certainly not the latter half of the 2nd century as previously argued. In fact, Cruz concludes the latest possible date for the writing of the fourth gospel is now generally recognized as the last decade of the 1st century. Now, we do have some external evidence that influences our dating of the Gospel of John. Clement of Alexandria says John returned to Ephesus after the death of the tyrant Domitian, and Irenaeus says he remained there until the time of Trajan. So this is one example of the types of data points that scholars try to connect when they're dating the Gospels. The fact that early church traditions mention John's residence in Ephesus continuing through to the time of Trajan has led to the conclusion that the fourth Gospel was probably written quite late in the 80s or 90s. And Carson and Moo suggest a date in the 80 to 85 range. We talked briefly about John being an eyewitness and an apostle. We could look at examples of that from his gospel as well as his epistles. But here's an interesting source that talks about John being an eyewitness. Among the things which have reached me about what Jesus the Son of Mary stated in the Gospel, which he received from God, for the followers of the Gospel, in applying a term to describe the Apostle of God, is the following. It is extracted from what John the Apostle set down for them when he wrote the Gospel for them. So this source clearly states that John was the Apostle, and therefore was an eyewitness, and was the author of the Gospel. What source is this? Well, that's right, it's one of Muhammad's biographies, Sirat Rasulullah, page 103 through 104. So if you run into a Muslim who wants to argue against John the Apostle as an eyewitness writing the Gospel, just remember that they have to argue against external evidence, church history and so forth. Internal evidence, some of that we've presented here, as well as, of course, their own texts. Let's summarize from what we talked about in the introduction to this series, as well as what we've covered in this video. We have no indication that the Gospels ever circulated without an appropriate title. It is improbable that the Gospels could have been renamed from another author and distributed so quickly. We talked about some historical data from patristic tradition. We looked at internal data from the Gospel relevant to authorship. We encouraged reasonable skepticism, and we'll talk more about that before we conclude this video. We reinforced with P52 with respect to the date of the Gospel, and our date probably somewhere in the 80s, cautiously suggesting 80 to 85. An additional argument launched against the Gospel of John was that it just didn't look Jewish. It looked like something that came from a much later Hellenistic setting. But then came the Dead Sea Scrolls. D.A. Carson refers to the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Qumran community when he notes countless parallels to the language and the thought of the Fourth Gospel. The parallels between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Fourth Gospel are not of the sort that encourage theories of direct dependence. What they do show, however, is that it is altogether unnecessary to account for John's language, even for some of his choice expressions, by appealing to a late Hellenistic environment. The closest parallels are often at Qumran, a conservative Jewish world that operated from about 150 BC to the fall of Jerusalem and Judea. So we've seen a couple of examples now of evidence versus speculation. P52, that little manuscript, sent thousands of pages of bad scholarship to the flames. Likewise, the Dead Sea Scrolls destroyed arguments about John's Gospel being late because it looked like something Hellenistic. No, John's Gospel actually looks a lot like the conservative Jewish community, the literature that they produced there at Qumran. Very similar styles. And so it's no need to push John's Gospel as late as some scholars want to. But imagine you're a Christian in these different environments. Imagine you're back in the 19th century and you're keeping in touch with what modern scholarship is saying about the dating of John's Gospel. And you're seeing the date go later and later and later, eventually on into the 3rd century. And the importance of John's Gospel is being diminished this whole time. What do? Well, that could really shake your faith. Similarly, before Qumran, when scholars are pointing out the alleged Hellenistic influence in John's Gospel, that could really shake your faith. Maybe you're starting to doubt John's Gospel itself. There are two basic questions that you can ask, because this sort of scholarly speculation is current now and it will continue into the future. Two basic questions. One, is there evidence for the conclusions that are being drawn? Very simple question, but sometimes we forget to ask it. And then number two, which is just a nuance of the first question, is the evidence that does exist being overstated? And that is the classic Bart Ehrman form of argument. He doesn't do this so much in his popular or his scholarly level material. He can get away with this in his popular level material, so he does it all the time. Is there evidence to support the claim that's being made? Number one. And number two, is the evidence that does exist being overstated? Those two questions, if you're a Christian in those times as well as now, asking those two simple questions can really get you sort of to the heart of the matter with respect to what's being said. Is it an overstatement of the data? And if so, well, then you shouldn't put too much weight into that argument. We talked a little bit about classicists and how some classicists criticize some New Testament scholars for their methodology. We all have our presuppositions, and we need to be careful to guard against them and approach the evidence as objectively as possible. With respect to the methodology in this series in particular, it's conservative. The conclusions are certainly conservative, but I'm not putting anyone out on a limb because I realize that people are going to use these arguments with their Muslim friends, perhaps in Speaker's Corner and places like that. Nothing that you've seen in this series, if you just memorize the summary at the end, as well as some of the talking points throughout the videos, you're not going to get hit with any sort of substantial, reasonable arguments in response. Now, you'll get some unreasonable arguments, perhaps like this. This particular individual recently quoted a movie as his source in his comment. And a little more with respect to our topic, the interpretation of the Logos being an entity, along with Yahweh as the Hellenistic, Greek, Jewish converts, etc. We've talked about this. When you're dealing with a comment like that, you know you're talking to someone who does not let the evidence influence their conclusion. So authorship and dating of the Gospels, of course, a very important topic, but not as important as who the Gospels were written about and why they were written. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So don't forget when you're discussing the authorship and dating of the Gospels that you also discuss the who and the why of the Gospels. Hope you enjoyed this series. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.